In this video, we are talking about the Sony S LOG3 profile and why you should use it to get the best image quality out of your camera. The first thing that you should know is this. If you're not using the S LOG3 profile on your Sony camera, you're basically not using the full potential of what your camera can do. But why is that? Let's start with the question, what is S LOG3 and why you should use it? S LOG3 is Sony's version of a logarithmic gamma curve. In simple terms, a log curve gives you a flat-looking image that is designed to preserve as much dynamic range as possible, meaning it captures both the brightest and the darkest parts of an image at the same time. Basically, it means your camera sensor can capture more brightness variations than the old Rec. 709 standard could handle. So S-Log helps you to fit all that information into a smaller video container. But why not just shoot with a contrasty image right away? There are three main reasons why. First, more flexibility in post, which is always a good thing. Second, it can save you if your exposure isn't set perfect in camera, because the dynamic range gives you more margins of error. And third, because the image is flatter, you can slightly overexpose to bring back the image down in post to get cleaner shadows if this is what you're going for. But we'll talk more about exposure later. Now that we know why S LOG3 is so important, let's look at how to activate it on your Sony camera. There are two ways to activate S LOG3 on your Sony camera, and each has its pros and cons. So let's start with the first one. The first option is to set a picture profile to S LOG3. To do that, go into the menu, navigate to exposure and color, and then color and tone, and here you find picture profile. Click on it, and now you can basically use every of these because you can customize them to your liking. So let's use picture profile 1, for example. You open it by pressing to the right on your control wheel or just tapping the arrow on the display. Now go to Gamma and set it to S LOG3 and set the color mode to S Gamut 3 Cine. And the benefit of doing this is you can now also go down to the details section, and here you can adjust the in-camera sharpening to your liking. The standard for S LOG3 is -7, but I like it with a little bit more sharpness added to it, so I set it to -4. Now go back with the left button to picture profile 1 and now select it. Your camera is set to S LOG3 now, but as this image looks flat now on your camera monitor, it can be hard to set the exposure correctly. That's why Sony added the Display Gamma Assist. You can activate it in the menu under Setup, Display Option, Gamma Display Assist on. It now gives you a preview on your screen with more saturation and contrast. There's only one problem with that. It has quite a strong contrast to it and can sometimes lead you into underexposing a bit. To get more control over the preview that's shown on your camera display when filming in S-Log, we can use the second log shooting option, which is Sony's dedicated log shooting mode. Go into the menu, find the main menu and then main menu 2. Click on the log shooting setting, and depending on your camera model you get different options, but the easiest to get started with is the flexible ISO setting. Then check if your color gamut is set to S Gamut 3 Cine. The setting embed LUT file can be useful if you want to attach a preview LUT to your clip, so when you use compatible software you could watch your video with the preview LUT you are using in camera. But for now, only Sony's own software supports it, so you can just turn it off. As you can see, what's missing in this mode is the ability to set the detail level, so in this mode we are stuck with the detail set to -7. So keep that in mind when comparing these both methods. Now switch to the main menu tab 1 and navigate to the LUT setting. You can select one of Sony's preview LUTs, but the cool thing is you can also create your own and import them here. But what you should also know is that if you set a LUT in here, your zebras and your histogram react to the image with your LUT applied, so you maybe need to adjust for that when using zebras or the histogram. For now we just keep it simple and use one of the existing LUTs. If you choose the 709 800% here, you have the same preview like with the Gamma Display Assist, but I prefer the S709 because it's a more balanced look and I find it easier to expose correctly. And speaking of exposing S LOG3, there are some rules or best practices that you can use to get perfect exposure every time. When it comes to exposing S LOG3, there are two options people debate over for years: overexposing versus not overexposing. And I wish there would be an easy answer to it, but there isn't, because it heavily depends on the scene you're trying to capture and what the end result after the color grading should look like. But to give you an easy rule of thumb to get started with: in most situations, it's better to let more light into the camera and bring the brightness down in post than underexpose and lifting the brightness up in post. But this rule does not save us from looking at each individual situation and deciding what exposure fits the shots we're trying to capture. As you can see, we actually don't need a one-fits-all rule. We need a practical step-by-step guide that helps us in every situation. So here's what you can do. First step is to set your camera to the base ISO. In most cases, this is the best starting point. Then decide stylistically what aperture you want to film your shot on. Do you want less depth of field or do you want more? After that, set the shutter to a value you want to use and what fits your frame rate. And now look at the image and ask yourself, is this where I want my final image to be? If it's way too bright, add an ND filter and bring the brightness down. If it's too dark, add light to the scene until you're happy with the result. Now think about, where are the important information in my frame? Where's the viewer going to look at? Ask yourself, should I protect the highlights more or should I protect the shadows more? If the answer is I like the exposure, you can just film like that. If you like the exposure but you also have a lot of headroom for your highlights and you want to have cleaner shadows, let more light into the camera by removing the ND filter. If that's not possible, open the aperture. If that's not possible or you just don't want to do it, it can make sense to boost the ISO a little. It often gives you a better result than making the image brighter in post because the camera applies in-camera noise reduction that is perfectly calibrated to the image sensor. Okay, so let's look at this in a practical example. Okay, so we use this dark scene of my workspace as an example. It's a dark scene which is probably a setting where most people experience issues when filming in S LOG3. We have a lot of dark parts in the image, but also important information on the bright computer screens that we want to preserve. So we need to make sure that we don't blow out the computer screens. This is a typical scene that you can encounter when you're shooting business events, for example, when there's a presentation on a projector, or if you're shooting narrative work and you have a night scene. We have set the camera to S LOG3, which is what the in-camera monitor is showing without any LUTs applied. On the reference monitor, we have the Phantom S LOG3 to Rec 709 Atomos monitoring LUT. This is the test setup that we use for this example. Our first reference tool for exposure is of course the screen that shows us the image, but there's also the first issue with that. For human eyes, brightness values always stand in correlation to their surroundings. That's why a gray color appears brighter when it's surrounded by a dark color, and the same gray color appears darker when it's surrounded by a bright color. If we want to judge exposure based on the monitor, we first have to match the monitor brightness to the light level that surrounds us. The reference monitor for this scene is way too bright. It's hard to show you through the camera, but it looks brighter to my eyes than the scene. To fix that, we can go into the settings and change the brightness here with the slider. It's currently set to 100%, so let's go down here to somewhere over maybe between 20 or 50. Yeah, this looks way more natural and way closer to what we are actually seeing in the scene. We can also do this with the in-camera monitor by going into the menu, then to monitor brightness. This is currently set to +2 because I was filming in a bright environment before. So let's turn this down to maybe -1, and now we can see the difference. You can also double check this by activating false color and see which parts of the image are really dark. In this case, I'm looking at the wall and the curtain on the left, which is in the blues, so it is the lowest exposure possible. And if I uncheck the false color now, when I look at the monitor, this part over here appears black to my eyes, not this gray that it was before. When I set it now back to 100% brightness, we can really see the difference. It appears more like this grayish color. If we turn it down back to 50 or so, it now appears dark again. The next step is to set the camera settings correctly, and you can start by setting the ISO to the base ISO of your camera. In most Sony cameras, the base ISO is the first number that doesn't have these lines surrounding the ISO value. For this camera, it's 640, but you can Google it for your specific camera model. Now we must decide which aperture value we want to use for this shoot. Of course, to let as much light in as possible, we must set the aperture to its lowest setting, but sometimes you want to film with more depth of field, for example, so you might need to use 4 or 5.6. In this case, let's say we want to use the aperture of 2.8, so let's leave it as it is. Next, we can set the shutter to 1/50 because we are filming with 25 FPS and we want to get natural motion blur. Now this is the image that we get if we set the camera to, let's say, our base values. Now we can see the image looks already like a moody, dark and contrasty scene and is somewhere in the ballpark where we want the final image to be. Now it's time to check the exposure tools. At first, let's look at the histogram, which is our first reference point if we don't want to use a second monitor. In this case, I've set the camera to S LOG3 preview, so the histogram shows us the S LOG3 values. We can see it shows us a lot of pixels are falling within the dark parts of the image, which matches what's actually happening in the scene. It's a dark scene, so it's okay that most of the image pixels are dark. Now let's see what happens if we would increase the ISO by an insane amount. Maybe let's go to, I don't know, maybe 40,000 for example. Now the histogram would show all the pixels in the bright region. This would be our first indicator that we are far off because a dark image is not supposed to look like this on a histogram. Even not if we wanted to overexpose it slightly to bring it back down in post. So a mismatch between the histogram and your scene is always an indicator that something is not as it should be. We can also verify this with false color. If we open false color right now, we would see that everything is in the orange. So not only all the screens, but also the table is orange. And also the dark curtains on the left side are somewhere in the middle, but when we look at the scene, it's supposed to be dark. So these curtains are supposed to be dark in camera. And the third tool that we can use is the zebras, which also works in camera. Set the lower limit to 94, which is the clipping point to S LOG3, and everything that's in the zebras is completely overexposed. So we see the table is overexposed, the computer screens are partly overexposed, so all that is within the zebras now is gone. And of course we can't leave it like this. So let's set it back to 640. With these settings, the image looks already pretty good and represents what we want the final image to be. Now we need to decide what are the important information in the image and make sure we get them within our range. In this example, we said that we wanted to make sure that we get the information in the computer screens. So let's check the MacBook screen with the Zebra tool. They're not showing up, which means the computer screen is not clipping. And if we increase the ISO once again, step by step, we can see that we have a little bit of headroom here. So the clipping only appears at 1600 ISO. So we know that we are within the range and we are good to go at 640. And by the way, we are also seeing zebras on top here at the light tube, but this is a bright light source, and no matter what camera you're using, if you film straight into a bright light source, this will always be clipped. That's no problem, so we don't need to adjust the exposure based on that. Now we could use this image as it is if we are happy with this dark look. So let's just capture it as it is with these settings that we can later compare them to different exposures that we are going to capture after that. Okay, this image now looks good, but it would be a little underexposed when you go by the Sony guide on how to expose S-Log3 correctly, but the exposure index on the camera says +2. And this is where this whole overexposure argument comes from. People think I have overexposed the image by more than 2 stops and the image is still dark. The problem with this exposure meter is it does not know what you're trying to do. It does not know if you like to have a dark or a bright image. It just measures different zones in the image and tries to give you an estimate of what's happening. That's why I wouldn't use it to base your exposure decision on. Now let's compare this exposure to what Sony recommends. Sony says we should expose the gray card to 41% IRE. Exposing with the gray card is not ideal for situations like this, but let's compare it anyway. We do this by setting zebras to 41% IRE, and now they don't appear, so we would have to increase the light that shines on the table to bring the exposure up. But let's say we can't change the light because we're filming an event and have no control over the lighting. The only thing that we can do now is to boost the ISO a little bit until the zebras show up on the gray card. The image got brighter now, but what happened to our MacBook screen? Let's change the zebras back to 94, and now we can see our monitor is overexposed. Of course, in an ideal situation, we would lower the brightness of the computer screen if we are planning to use this exposure in camera, but for this example, let's leave it as it is. We again get a test shot for this exposure to compare it. Now, there's also the opinion out there that you should always overexpose S-Log3 by 2 stops. Alistair Chapman created a LUT to use as preview while recording, so let's use this on the second monitor. Just go in here and change the LUT to the Alistair Chapman LUT. And as you can see, the preview image gets way darker now, and that's the idea behind this LUT. It shows us a darker image that we think the image is way too dark, and we expose brighter. So let's increase the exposure with ISO again to get it somewhere in the ballpark. I just do it by eye until we have a look that's similar to our first setting. Maybe somewhere at 6400 would be good. And now we can see we already overexposed both of the displays. So let's take a test shot with these settings. Okay, now the next method is the ETTR, which means that we just expose the image as bright as possible without clipping the highlights and lower the exposure in post. So let's try that. Zebra set to 94 plus. We already see clipping appear at 1000 ISO, so maybe let's go with 800 and get another test shot. Now, this was the situation if we can't adjust the lights in the scene, but now let's look what happens if we would be able to adjust the light. So let's go to the MacBook monitor and turn the brightness down. That is somewhere on the same brightness as the other display, or maybe even a little bit lower. Now we can increase the exposure a little bit with ISO without clipping the monitor right away. Let's see if we could clean up the shadows by increasing the ISO in camera and lowering it in post. Maybe set it to 3000, 3200 and get a test shot again. And now let's compare them in the color grading. So here's the first image with the ISO set to 640, which looks pretty good. We have all the information in the display and noise is clean. Next up, we have the image where I raised the exposure a little bit in post to match the 800 ISO. As you can see, noise is not too crazy. And this is the 800 ISO shot, which is probably the best middle ground in this example when we can't change anything of the lighting. And now we have the 1250 ISO, where we can see we are starting to lose some information in the display, but the noise is a bit cleaner. And at this ISO setting, we can now clearly see that we are losing color information on the color chart, and also some of the text is gone. And this is what I meant by you have to decide what is more important. If you want to lose some of the highlight detail to get cleaner shadows, then this is what you can do. You can overexpose even in situations like this, but if you have important information on the display that you want to preserve as well, then all you can do is to stay lower with your exposure and underexpose S-Log. As we saw in the image with the 640 ISO, it's no problem to let these dark parts be dark even when shooting with S-Log. And now this would be the best solution to this problem. This is the ISO set to 3200, where we lowered the brightness of the MacBook monitor, and this looks best in my opinion because we can see all the information on the left display. It's not extremely bright as it was before with the other shots, and even with the ISO set to 3200 we get clean shadows because the in-camera noise reduction cleans them up a bit for us. So I hope this clarified some of the issues that you had with exposing S LOG3. Let me know if this was helpful in the comments below, and I see you in the next one.